Well, thank you very much, everyone. Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone, the people that is here in person, but also the people that is online for joining us in this second seminar in our series, England toward a tertiary education system. We are going to be for doing 8 weeks discussing this policy agenda and these policy discussions on tertiary education in this country. And today I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Anne-Marie Bathmaker. Anne-Marie is Professor Emerita of Vocational and Higher Education in the University of Birmingham. She's been working on vocational and higher education, especially in areas addressing and inequalities in this context. So we are very happy to have you in this, and thank you very much for coming from Birmingham. Today, the presentation is going to be around 45 minutes to 50 minutes, and then we are going to have 30 or 25 minutes for comments and questions. And this presentation, this session is going to be recorded. So we are going to put it available during the next days, following days in our YouTube channel, the SKOPE YouTube channel. So over to you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your invitation. And I look forward to the session. I wasn't at last week's session, but I have looked at the slides. I was online, but I couldn't actually hear it. So I do know what happened last week. So those of you that were there, then you're up to speed at the same place as me. Today, I'm not going to be talking about directly about the same things as you heard last week. I'm going to be looking back in time to work that's been happening in England to bring in that's very specifically further and higher education closer together, and looking back at previous attempts to do that and looking at what we can learn for the current context for that. And I'm going to do that from a Bourdieusian perspective. Quite a lot of my work uses Bourdieusian concepts and tools. So I'm going to start off with some caveats around what I'm going to talk about, and then talk about the reconfiguring of the tertiary landscape and the place and further education, and then talk very briefly about the policy context in England, and then talk about looking at the system from a Bourdieusian perspective and using Bourdieusian tools. Talk a bit about and give you some examples of findings from the Further Higher project, which looked at combining further and higher education in the 2000s, and then after that, then summarised by looking at potential and pitfalls of an integrated tertiary system and identify a few key issues that I think we might want to be thinking about in terms of a more integrated system in England in the 2020s. So let me start then, first of all, with my caveats. This session builds on from the session presented by James Robson last week. He covered a lot of ground, particularly around the white paper that came out at the end of last year. I'm not going to cover the ground covered by him. And that was much better explained and analysed than I can do, although I know the white paper as well. So if you ask questions about it, I can attempt to answer them. And my focus is on one aspect of a tertiary system, and particularly the place of further education colleges. But please don't assume that a tertiary system is only about further education and higher education, but that's the focus that I'm going to take this afternoon. And then I do have to say that thinking with Bourdieu can lead towards what in German is thought of as bodenlose Niedergeschlagenheit, the absolute depths of despair, with very limited optimism for the future. So you have to bear with that. I think the helpfulness of the lens is to highlight some of the limitations and concerns we might have. It may not be a lens that really helpfully looks towards an optimistic future. And then I should say, what I'm not going to talk about today is what I talked about in the Bira blog, which lies behind this whole series. And in that Bira blog, I actually focused on the way a tertiary system needs to embrace a really expansive understanding of adult learning and adult lifelong learning, and that it needs to include learning for life and not just learning for working life. I'm not going to address that here. That's a whole area that would take up the whole session, but it's in the background and should not be forgotten. So the reconfiguration of the tertiary landscape and reconfiguring what we might understand as a tertiary landscape is not just happening in England or in the 4 countries of the UK. It's happening all over the place. And here are some examples from European countries with, over the last 10 years, over 100 initiatives identified by CDFOP that are currently taking place to try and look at how tertiary systems might become more closely integrated or work together, particularly looking at permeability between VET and other pathways, how they might interact rather than work completely separately, including looking at how academic and vocational pathways might enjoy permeability, with over 120 different initiatives there, and then extending VET to higher levels, which has become increasingly seen as normal in England, but also in countries internationally. But it is a new normal, although it's existed for some time. It's becoming increasingly prevalent, and expanding VET programs up to levels 5 to 8, which is taking us to quite high levels, taking us to bachelor's, and then beyond bachelor's to the equivalent of master's level and above. And again, many initiatives listed, and you could see those initiatives as attempts to create a tertiary system or some more coordinated system of what's happening in terms of tertiary education across these countries. So what does that include? It includes legislation and national strategies. So there are countries which are focusing really hard on shifting what their legislation and strategies look like, such as Belgium, which has legislation for dual higher education, Norway that's got a strategy for higher vocational education. There's facilitating transition pathways that's taking place in Sweden, for example, facilitating permeability between secondary VET and tertiary education, and France doing similar facilitation of transition pathways, so you can move from VET programs into higher education, and also extending VET to higher levels, as mentioned before, across a range of different countries. And this isn't happening just, these are examples all from Europe. There's plenty of examples, for example, more and more being written in China, in Australia, in South American countries, and in sub-Saharan African countries about similar sorts of developments. And it's also appearing in research. There's growing interest internationally in what's happening. And themes that we're finding are VET's contribution to solving the high skills shortage in the context of knowledge economies. And the trend, this is a key concern, particularly in German-speaking countries, the trend towards higher participation in higher education, which is undermining forms of VET that were valued in the past. So the strong apprenticeship system that Austria, Switzerland and Germany have enjoyed and continue to enjoy is to some extent now facing real challenges from people who are thinking, actually, I'll participate in academic higher education rather than following an apprenticeship route. So real questions being asked in research about that. But also a key theme is about VET providing pathways for underserved and disadvantaged learners. And that includes students from working class backgrounds, from ethnic origins, from ethnic minorities, from Indigenous learners, but also increasingly migrants and refugees. So people coming into countries from elsewhere and not fitting straightforwardly into the standard systems and using VET as their way of making their way. And then the other big theme in the literature, obviously, is the role played by public policy and how that shapes and influences and is involved in evolving systems and practices. So what does that look like in the context of England, and particularly in relation to the place of FE and VET? James Robson last week talked about some of the key things that are shaping what's happening in England. We've got an industrial strategy which has got 8 different sectors that are deemed to be the growth driving sectors in England. We've got an organisation, Skills England, now that's responsible for what goes on in the skills part of the system. And interestingly, as has happened so many times before, started off in one government department, the Department for Education, and is now very quickly moved to the DWP, the Department for Work and Pensions. that may or may not be a good thing, but what's interesting is that it starts in one place and very quickly shifts. And those civil servants are not necessarily all talking to each other and not necessarily all talking the same language. We've got local skills improvement plans, and I will come on to emphasise the importance of local in terms of what a tertiary system might involve, and those skills improvement plans are supposed to focus on collaboration and developing local needs within a tertiary system. But we've also had a curriculum and assessment review, which you could be forgiven for thinking is about schools, but it actually has proposed, and at the minute the government has taken up the notion of yet another new vocational qualification called V level, which we're all hugely excited about, because we've now got A levels and we've got T levels, and we're now going to have V levels. And if I wasn't concerned about it, then I talked to a friend of mine yesterday and she said, my son's talking about doing a T level. I've no idea what they are, but it sounds like he's keen. And I thought, we're really going places here. I was there with GMVQs back in the 1990s. We've moved on through a whole set of other qualifications since then. The issue about new and shifting qualifications is hugely problematic, but also interesting in this space. But we've also got the lifelong learning entitlement. So we've got a single funding system coming in for qualifications at level 4 and above. So for academic and vocational routes, we've got an international education strategy, which is of interest to not just the academic part of the sector, where you might think it's just universities are interested, but all sorts of other parts of the sector, including FE colleges, are interested in what that strategy might do for them or not. And of course, we've got what James Robson talked about in detail, the post-16 education and skills white paper. So it's a busy and complicated context, and those are just some of the key things going on. But perhaps key to all of that is that it's a real moving mosaic. It doesn't stand still. And if we all look at it next week, then we'll probably find some more things that are appearing or disappearing, and things moving from across different departments, as I mentioned. But there are also different national level organisations who are all in there, and what might be seen as meddling. There's Skills England, but then there's Ofsted, and then there's the Office for Students. And quite importantly, that we kind of half forget is UKRI, the UK Research and Innovation Council, which really affects certainly the academic part of what's going on if we've got a tertiary sector, but also affects other things, as you'll see in a bit. Got a new vocational qualification pathway, and we mustn't forget, and as was mentioned last week, we've got employers. But employers are not just one type of employer. There are micro, small, medium and large scale employers who all have different interests in what a tertiary system can do and where they might fit in and what they're involved in. So it's a really complex situation that we're looking at. So I'm going to talk and home in on one particular bit of it and talk about the position of further education colleges in England in the context of that landscape. This is what it looks like currently in the 2020s, even with just a small number of the wide range of institutions and organisations we might be looking at. There are 157 further education colleges, 24-25, 218 colleges if you include specialist colleges, art and design colleges, sixth form colleges. And then there are 149 of those which are offering higher education as part of what their provision is. And that compares with 266 universities. So you can see that there's not quite a balance there of the different types of institutions. And there are 6 private providers offering with degree awarding powers, offering higher education. And there are 1,700 independent private training providers. And I haven't even started on third sector organisation, for which I could find no numbers. But I volunteer in a third sector organisation in Birmingham. It's teeming with them, and they're all running training at tertiary level for all sorts of people doing all sorts of things. There's lots going on out there. It's lots of different organisations that form part of that landscape. And key in terms of what my focus is here is that there's overlapping provision, because we're talking about the possibility of tertiary systems that might therefore collaborate and offer a way of understanding and working your way through systems, potentially not too much overlap, sharing out what's going on. There's quite a lot of overlap, certainly at the present time. And as to give an example, overlap is higher education study in further education, but it's very specific in what it looks like. So in 2023-24, 4%, so that's not a huge percentage of student enrolments in higher education were in further education colleges in England. But at sub-degree level, so at levels 4 and 5, which is not bachelor level, it's the first 2 years of a bachelor degree level, 61% of foundation degrees were in further education colleges. So that's where the HE work is much more predominant. And also higher national diplomas, which still exist and are still regularly used. More than half of them were taught in colleges. So the key place where higher education is focused for those colleges is in that level 4 or 5, which according to the government is what we should be focusing on at the moment, and is seen as a key area for development. So this is just to remind us, though, that sub-degree participation is low. So you've got, in going through to 23-24, 65% of participation in bachelor degrees, what was in bachelor degrees, only 1% in foundation degrees of enrolments was in foundation degrees, and only 1% in HNCs, HNDs. So it's tiny, actually. It might be quite a lot in a college for their HE, but it's not very many overall. It's not where the majority of people are going. They're looking to follow a bachelor degree. So let me just look at what I think are appearing as the current best words in this notion of how we might have a tertiary system. The notion of local ecologies of practice and the notion of partnership. Those keep appearing in the literature. They're also key in what policy is saying, and they're seen to be, the magic wand, really. They could be really good, and there's some really interesting work going on around what those might look like. But I think we have to really think hard about what that means. So I'm just going to give an example now of local. What does a local ecology of practice involve and comprise? So if you're going to have your tertiary system really focusing and making the most of local, what might that mean? And then if you're going to have partnership, and that's what the examples that I'll give will draw attention to. Does that partnership look like competition or collaboration? Is it like some sort of vertical stratification where some people do the really top stuff and other people get left with the bits that are left over at the bottom end of a stratified system? Or do you try and have horizontal complementarity across what you're doing within that local system? So I live in Birmingham, which is the second largest city in the UK. This is what, it's not everything, but this is what a local ecology of tertiary education might comprise in that context. We've got 2 further education colleges. There are far fewer further education colleges than there used to be because they amalgamated. We've got 2 extremely large further education colleges. We've also got an adult education college that everyone forgets. Hardly any. I think there are 3 in the country, and we've got one of them in Birmingham. We've got 5 universities. So if you think you've got a lot, we're doing really quite a lot better here in Birmingham. We've got 5. There they all are. We've got 63 apprenticeship training providers, and 46 of them are private training providers, and they're involved somewhere along the line. We've got 8 adult education centres. There are probably more, but according to Birmingham Adult Education Service, there are 8 adult education centres. They're offering training of various kinds, and we've got 7 community centres offering training courses. That's just a starter for 10. As I say, there are other things. So there's quite a big range of people and organisations and interests that would potentially form part of Birmingham's more integrated tertiary system. So how would that turn into local partnership? Well, it will do it through local skills improvement plans, which is what the government has asked all local areas to produce, and a local improvement plan for 26 to 29. And that really emphasizes collaboration. It has to be a collaborative process, and it has to involve partners, and further and higher education providers are identified as really key to that. And they're strategic partners in developing that local plan to bring knowledge and to bring technical skills to the local area. But it also includes a whole set of other providers and organisations that I haven't even named yet in this local ecology of practice, which is job centres and careers services and sector bodies and trade unions. So there's even more people that the government already recognises as being part of this local ecology of practice, which could be wonderful, but it's a growing, moving mosaic that has to think hard about how it brings those people together. Now, the challenge, I think, is, do all those organisations understand partnership in the same way? So I'm just going to give you two examples. This is the University of Birmingham. I worked at the University of Birmingham. I'm emerita there. I have a lot of respect for the Vice-Chancellor. He's doing a really interesting job. But this is what he says, and is very clear about what partnership means locally for him. It means 8 research-intensive universities in the Midlands region. Absolutely no mention of FE colleges or training providers or anybody else. It's those 8 research-intensive universities. And what are they focusing on? Strengthening the research and innovation ecosystem, which is really important. But it's running in a completely parallel line to some of the other things that people are doing. And they've got 2 different key organisations there, Midlands Innovation and Midlands Mindforce, and they're focusing really strongly on both developing a research and innovation ecosystem and then commercialising that into science and technology innovations. This is Southern City College, which is also dear to my heart. I've worked with them quite a bit in the past, and they do wonderful work. Their understanding of local partnership is very different. They identify these as their 3 areas of partnership on their website. Skills West Midlands and Warwickshire, that's about local businesses and further education providers and independent training providers. You will notice there is no mention of a university in that list. And they are focusing on high quality training initiatives. And they're also involved with Made in the Midlands, which is a group that champions British industry. And they're also involved in the North Birmingham Economic Recovery Board. And that's bringing together employers and training providers, community organisations and public agencies to have a recovery plan for North Birmingham. Now, they're both sides are really important things, but they're running, for my money, completely parallel and separate. And if we're talking about an integrated tertiary system where there's interaction and working together, at the moment, it looks like if you're really busy, you're not focusing on the integration bit. You've got your key agenda and it's very different, just from those 2 examples. So it raises questions about what might be possible. So for me, what those 2 examples just help us to get is a different understanding of what local involves and where local is, who the key partners are that you're going to be partnering with, and what the core focus of work is that you will do to support your local ecology of practice. So moving on to thinking in Bourdieu's terms, the university and the college seem to operate in very different social spaces, in different fields, where there are different forms of capital that carry value in those different social spaces. So my question is, what are the implications when we're trying to move forward to a more integrated system of tertiary education? So I'm going to use an example from a project that I was involved in, where we used Bourdieu's tools to try and look hard at what was going on in trying to integrate further and higher education. And I'm going to draw specifically on Bourdieu's concept of field, but that comes as triumvirate of field, capital and habitus. And also we used in the study we were working on then the notion of institutional habitus, which Diana Ray explains very clearly as a notion that's not quite ethos, because it's about notions of how institutions have ingrained ways of thinking and being and doing, and that was very helpful as well. But I'm focusing particularly here on how the notion of field might help in terms of understanding what we found. So just as a kind of reminder of what Bourdieu was trying to do with this notion of field, Bourdieu understands field as a particular social space where there's a network or a configuration of relations between positions in the field, which is why I talked about this college and the university. The way they present themselves suggests they're in very different social spaces or field and position themselves differently. And what Bourdieu says is that you can represent this social space on the basis of difference and distribution and a set of properties that are active within the social universe in question. And therefore, those things can give you strength, they can give you power within the universe, and they can give power and position to the holders, which means that the agents or the groups of agents that are in those spaces are defined by their relative positions in that space. So if you were to have one tertiary system of education and you put all those different organisations within it, in Bourdieu's terms, you'd work out where are they positioned in that space, and are they positioned vertically or horizontally in relation to one another, and what sorts of things allow them to be positioned in those places, and does being in a particular position in the space, Bourdieu would argue, if you're in the higher part of those spaces, then you've got more power and you've got more chance of determining what the rules of the game in that space are. So for Bourdieu, positioning in those spaces in the field is based on the sorts of capital. You've got social, cultural, and economic capital, but it's that specific capital that's relevant to the particular purposes. So in the examples that I just gave, the relevant capital for the university was research. That was the capital that you got was by doing research and turning that research into commercial value. In the college, then it was having relationships with business and developing technical skills. So that makes the cultural capital in each case valuable, but it doesn't mean that they're commensurate if they try and come together. And there's questions to be asked. And so for Bourdieu and in Bourdieu's way of thinking, those positions in the field then also lead to ways of thinking and being and doing. So a habitus that's aligned with whatever's going on in the field and the positions that you've got in the field. So what Bourdieu uses regularly in terms of understanding that is the notion of market and being able to make capital exchanges, but also the notion of game, and says that there are dynamics in a game which allows you to negotiate and develop rules and think about how you're positioned and then negotiate those positions. But he also says, which I think is important and interesting, is that you make judgments. You not only try to position yourself potentially and work out what the rules are, but you also work out what's possible. What is possible for me? What is impossible? And what's the probable? And it's not just as an individual you do that, but so do institutions and so do networks and organizations. They work out what is possible and what's probable. Key though, and that's definitely important in terms of thinking about a tertiary system, is that fields aren't fixed. They arise and they grow and they change. So we might have what is currently called a higher education field, but it might become part of something called a tertiary education field and may shift and change over time. So a serious question to ask is, what is the social space that is going to be this integrated social field? Is it one field? Is it a combination of different fields? Is it different spaces that try and work together, or does it become one amalgamated space? And what are the implications if you're an organisation that's part of that system? So the questions that I asked, therefore, and what are key questions, I think, is, do those social spaces become more porous and more fluid? In other words, do they stop being so closed and siloed if you have a tertiary provision? And does that open up and equalise chances? In other words, does it make it more possible for more people and more organisations to be able to do and achieve things that they may want to achieve? Or does it simply hide the inequalities that already exist? And therefore, does it matter in terms of a tertiary field? Does it matter how it's configured in terms of students and learners, in terms of the people that the tertiary system is supposed to enable to do something with their lives? Does it matter how we configure the field? So I'm going to talk then very briefly about the work of the Further Higher project and what we found when we researched issues that are very pertinent to the idea of a coordinated tertiary system back in the 2000s. We undertook work in four institutions And I'm going to focus here very much on how the positioning in social space was used strategically to see how institutions could position themselves. We called it the Further Higher Project because we had 4 institutions that were working across the further education and the higher education sectors, very clearly 2 separate sectors, particularly in back then, and they were bringing together both further and higher education in one institution. We called them dual sector institutions. In one case, the institution called itself a dual sector institution, but they were certainly dual sector in terms of working across both sectors and offering both forms of provision. And what I'm going to just do is outline what that looked like and what it involved. So it sounded very lovely. 4 institutions working really hard, apparently, to offer both further and higher education, and it might offer great opportunities, but certainly was a possibility for bringing together different forms, levels, and types of education and training. So our first institution was a post-92 university. These are all pseudonyms. So one was what we call Southley University in the south of England. So it's a university, started off in the university sector, and it had 3 main campuses, and then it merged with a further education college and created what it called, this is the one that called itself a dual sector institution. 70% was HE and 30% was FE work. And it said it was going to give equal commitment to higher education and further education, and it was going to encourage progression between further education and higher education. And the Vice Chancellor was very clear about that and was really committed to having this really close relationship. Now, without going into further detail on what happened in the meantime, that further education work and higher education work remained almost completely separate. In fact, on different campuses where hardly anyone ever visited from one campus to the other. And the arrangement lasted 6 years. They have separated and they are now 2 completely separate institutions again. So the FE college has gone back to being an FE college. The university has now divested itself of its FE work. Having, as you can see, had a really strong commitment to apparently making something work, but didn't manage to push it through. Our second college was a college in the further education sector, Citygate College. It's in a large city in the Midlands. When we first went there, it was in the further education sector, but it moved into the higher education sector in 2000. Sorry, just before we went there, it moved into the higher education sector, and that was seen as really key. It was a really important process of positioning. The college said that that gave them freedom, it gave them independence, and they wanted to position themselves as a specialist provider of higher education as well as offering further education. So it was a very clear process of positioning yourself, what you thought was a good place to be in the market, and you would therefore gain advantages. And they also were successful in getting taught degree awarding powers, so they can award their own degrees. They've now got university in their title. But what's very interesting is that although they've got taught degree awarding powers, a lot of their degrees are awarded under the name of the local research intensive university, because they can position themselves better by awarding degrees with the research intensive university's name on it. In particular, their international students will be attracted by that. So a lot of activity going on in thinking, where do we want to position ourselves? What's going to be advantageous? They've maintained successful further and higher education, but as you can see, it's very carefully managed and strategically thinking through what are the capitals that will work, what will make it successful for us. Our third institution, which we called East Heath College, was a really large college and the largest provider of directly funded HE. And it called itself a mixed economy institution, and it had higher, further and adult education. And again, it had a research relationship with a degree awarding relationship with a research intensive university, but saw yet another opportunity. There was a gap. It was in a region with no university, and therefore saw this opportunity to become deemed as the university in the area. So in 2007, rather than staying a mixed economy institution, it became 2 different institutions, one called University Centre and one called an FE College. So from being a combined dual sector institution, it separated itself out and seen that as the way to position itself successfully. And finally, we had a college called North Green Federal College, which was a much more typically further education college, which considered itself to be doing lots of widening participation work, provided vocational progression routes, but the HE was only 3% of the work that the college did, and saw itself very much as a college with an FE culture, with a bit of HE that was an afterthought on the side. And the FE and HE was considered to be very separate. Different markets is what one of the senior managers said to us, and they don't get progression onto HE on their courses. They offered foundation degrees validated by a local post-19 university, and they had a really close relationship with that university. So they had created partnerships with higher education that saw themselves very much as FE and positioned themselves there, but creating a partnership with colleges in the area. So let me just give you very briefly a bit of insight into what we found when those changes happened at East Heath College, where they separated themselves out. As they separated themselves out, what they did was they stopped people from teaching on courses that were both FE and HE. So you either taught on the lower level courses or the VET courses, or you taught on the HE courses. They then stopped communicating with each other. They stopped matching courses. So if you did a level 3 in business studies, you wouldn't find a degree that matched what your level 3 course had been. And they had lots of stuff that advertised for HE students only, making clear that they didn't want any overlap between what the students did, and created two very distinct institutional habituses in Bourdieu's terms, one of a FE study, one of HE study. Separated the spaces. You weren't expected to go into that space. If you were FE, you weren't expected to go into the HE institution, and very much separating things out. And then let me give you an example of Citygate College, which, as I said, is the one institution in that study that has continued to actually successfully combine FE and HE. They focused, interestingly, very hard on their relationship and crossing the boundaries. And they worked out ways of playing the game of creating successful progression routes. So in this instance, they had an NVQ in culinary arts, which is cooking for people like me, but quite high level cooking, and they gave progression routes into their higher level and degree level work in that area, and were very well known for it. But they worked out that this was not going to be possible because you had to study HE by applying through UCAS, and the UCAS application system doesn't work for FE students, because FE students decide in September that at the end of September they want to follow an HE course, and they're supposed to have decided it a year before. So the college worked out a way of bypassing that, and the staff somehow managed to slide in their applications very late on so that they could move on to the HE course as the autumn came, and worked out that the successful students were able then to move on. But it was the staff that provided those capitals, the social capital, and then also the knowledge capital to make those applications and enable the students to do that. But very much about redefining and reshifting what the cultures were there across that FE and HE, and looking quite different to the other institutions. And as the program coordinator says, it's now become part of the culture that you can move on. So it had actually shifted the thinking and made it possible for students to imagine themselves doing something and moving on. So what can we learn? From that project? Well, first of all, policy is really important in shaping what goes on. So in the case of the Further Higher project, there was a real separation. So in all sorts of ways, funding arrangements, audit and inspection arrangements, conditions of service, qualification systems. And as you've heard, we've got the lifelong learning entitlement, which already is trying to shift that. So there are things that policy can do to try and shift what a structure of a field looks like. Because as those policy divisions move down into institutions, as you can see, they become reinforced. You get people who are then only teaching an FE or only teaching an HE because they have different conditions, different pay, and so on. So policy is important and can help to shape and structure the field. Dual sector, what we found was that the dual sector FE, whether it's a field or a subfield, does have, and the staff talked about it, had a notion of what it felt like, what the institutional habitus, what the cultures were within those institutions, and whether they were able to create a sense of belonging for a diversity of students. And what's very interesting is, particularly in the FE sector in England and in FE colleges, that notion of being able to make students and learners and trainees feel welcome is a really key part of the institutional habitus. Not necessarily as strong in universities, although it's there more than it used to be. And of course, there's dangers. It can feel very comfortable and you make students feel okay and you don't necessarily push them. But on the other hand, it can enable them to learn and be successful. So there are key issues around what you do if you create something that's more combined. Whose cultures are going to dominate? Is it really important that 95% of the students complete their courses, which is really important in the university sector? Or is it really important that you manage to hang on to a reasonable number of them, but it might only be 50% in the FE sector, for example? Very different completion rates, which are considered to be acceptable, and really shifts our way of thinking about these things. And then knowing where you're positioned in the field, I think, was really key. And then working out how to play that positioning to your advantage. And there are real strengths and limitations that those institutions identified in terms of where they were positioned, and knowing whether they were positioned more advantageously. If they were in an FE field offering HE, you've got a lot of prestige. You're an FE college, but you offer higher education. Whereas if you're in the higher education field and you just do a bit of level 4 and 5, you're the bottom of the pile. Where's the best place to be? You have to judge what's the best place to be, and where's it best for your students to be? Is it better to push your students to progress from your college to somewhere prestigious, or is it better to encourage them to stay with you and progress? And judgments are made. And these things are thought through. So that felt very key in terms of what we were learning about both how the institutions positioned themselves, but also how they thought about their trainees and their students. So what goes on then in this in a tertiary system, and what is that work that's going on in terms of differentiation and stratification? Certainly what we found and I think raises real big questions for a tertiary system is that there are hierarchies of value and there are capitals that count differently in different parts of what we were looking at. So the dual sector institutions, as I said, they stand out in the further education field because of their higher education provision, but in higher education, they're at the lower end of the hierarchy. And what's also interesting, though, that we found was that if you have vocational degrees that have a clear labour market destination, then where it offers a license to practice, which isn't so common in England, but it does exist, they are more highly valued and they are more selective in their intake as well. So in other words, they will select rather than simply take anyone in their intake. So that could apply, for example, to teaching assistants who would actually have a direct route into employment, for example. So it's not always just, we're not talking just high level occupations, becoming an architect or becoming a doctor or whatever. There's also medium skilled occupations which have value because they lead to a labour market destination. And the third thing was having clear and visible connections with business and industry, and you can creating social connections that strengthen the prospects for employment, and those were valued really highly as well. And my question in the back of my mind there is, of course, if you've got employers in a region, who are they going to partner with? Are they going to partner with the research intensive universities and with the FE colleges and with the FEHE colleges and with the training providers, or are they going to take their pick? They're going to position themselves as well. So there are potential and pitfalls is really what I'm saying in terms of coordinated field of tertiary education. And if we're thinking field and we're using Bourdieu to think about that, then we can think about whether that looks like one heteronymous field, in other words, one field where all sorts of different things are going on, And that brings in a whole range of different questions about how that fits into a more globalized field where there are definitely massive hierarchies of who goes where and who does what, and whether you therefore move away completely from one country to another to study, which you certainly wouldn't be a lot less likely to be doing in the further education or the training parts of the field. But even if there's only one field, there are going to be different subfields which are differently positioned in terms of power. But you could also conceive of a tertiary system as having a diversity of different fields and that are operating differently, and therefore have to work out ways of having different cultures and how they come together, and how those social spaces can work together and potentially come together in what they do, or work to be more porous. But you have to work hard at how that's going to work as well, and how does that enable movement for students and learners. So why have I found Bourdieu helpful in thinking about that? It raises questions about power. It raises questions about power relations across a more unified, even if it's heterogeneous, field of tertiary education, or a confederation of differentiated fields, about who has power, who's able to make decisions, who's able to make what they have count and weigh. It focuses our attention on where different parts of the field and where different fields are positioned in relation to one another, and who's positioned where, and who's able to establish the conditions that govern the field. In my examples, will the FE colleges have the same power as the HE institutions in Birmingham in determining what that potential tertiary system might look like? In Bourdieu's terms, those who have greater power are likely to have more say in what future developments look like. So to conclude, key issues I think worth thinking about. We're talking about a tertiary system, not a sector. So how should we understand that then in terms of social space? What does that look like and involve? And that leads us to ask what forces are driving the rules of the game in that social space or spaces of a tertiary system, going back to questions around coordination and integration, seamlessness, complementarity, competition, collaboration. What sorts of those factors are going to be the things that drive what happens? And always key, what are the implications for learners? Who participates where and in what? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie. We have some time for questions, like half an hour for question. I can start with one. I want to bring the idea that you mentioned that your presentation wasn't covered about your blog, and this idea that the education also needs to prepare for life and not just for work life. And I'm thinking on the emphasis of the policy agenda that is very narrow, in my opinion, toward employability and economic growth. And how much that tertiary education system frame on that terms can reconfigure in some ways the field, and how much this valuation and the different positions can be valued in a different way in a system that is just focused on employability.
Yeah, I think so. Firstly, I think it's really hard at a national level. Then there are things that can happen at national level which value learning, make it possible to get funding to do things that aren't just work related. Let me give you an example from Singapore, where Skills Singapore gives training credits, but you don't have to prove that they've got anything to do with work. And I was told by the person last year who runs the system in Singapore that a lot of people were using it to learn Korean because they like K-pop music. And it's accepted that you can do lots of different things. In other words, you can develop via policy at national level cultures and practices that may lead people to do things that link to their working lives, but engage them in participating in all sorts of things in their lives, but also enable them to spread that out in different ways. So at national policy level, you can do those things. At local level, I'd like to think those things are really possible. What I didn't say about Birmingham, as my example, is that we're in dire straits. We've got a council that's moribund and really struggling. We've got institutions, as you saw, that are working separately and independently. We've got a third sector that does lots of work with people who are not working and does things with them to enable them to participate in things like sport, enable them to just leisure activities and so on, partly with a view to getting them engaging in wider social life and potentially employment. So it might be used as a reasoning, but it's bringing people in and enabling them to do things and helping them to deal with things like budgeting and so on and so forth. So there's a third sector that I haven't even mentioned that is struggling with minimal money, but does some of those things, which is about life and not just about learning for employed life. And then my big fear, and I don't know how you shifted it, is that institutions like universities and colleges struggle now with the challenges that they face, and to hold on to some of the other things that count and did count and have counted in their histories, which is about engaging with people in learning and engaging with people in learning knowledge and skills that will be part of a broad understanding of what their lives are about. I'm sort of seeing that disappearing, I think. I'm not even sure it was with training providers ever. We cling on to the last vestiges. So at a local level, I feel very, very despondent about the feasibility. I should add to that half our libraries are closed. So that was the other place where one of the things I said in my blog is that learning goes on all over the place. It goes on in libraries, it goes on in public spaces, it goes on in parks, and Birmingham's busy selling all this. So yeah, that's my demoralised answer, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
And Hugh Morris got a
There is a question?
Hugh Morris.
Maybe we should ask
Hugh?
Yeah. Do you want me to say something, Gavin? So my question is really about the exchange rate between different forms of capital. And I've got a long comment in the chat bar, but it's basically saying the exchange rate seems to be changing for economic capitals, and that reflects changes in political capital and possibly cultural capital for the different providers of education in the post-16 space. And so I raise the question, does it matter how they're organised administratively if what seems to be happening is questioning whether there shouldn't be a stronger rationale for why some bits get more economic capital than others?
Right, if I've understood your question rightly, and it's a really important question that you might give different amounts of funding to different parts of a broader tertiary system. In my view, it matters a great deal. If you want to make it possible to offer high quality provision across the sector, across a system, and you want to demonstrate that the different parts of the system are valued, then to have resources that are very incommensurate with one another, I think makes that very difficult. And looking back to periods when there was greater value attached to providing for trainees and learners who weren't deemed to be the kind of gold standard top end of what was available, when you valued that more, it felt like there was more opportunities to build successful routes, which weren't necessarily commensurate, but they were at least providing high quality. And I think that's really hard to provide high quality if you're not going to think hard about how you fund and resource it adequately.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I suppose what I'm saying is they are differently funded at the moment. And what has happened over the last 15 to 20 years is that FE has been, until recently, seen its funding very substantially reduced. And HE has seen its funding very substantially increased, largely because of high fee international students and initially a very favourable student loan system. I think that the economic returns of those different types of activity are changing. Graduates are finding it more difficult to get well-paid jobs, and there's a chronic shortage of skills in the economy in areas where FE and apprenticeships have traditionally been prevalent. And so that changes the cultural and political value attached to these things. And then that translates perhaps into the economic capital that government is prepared to distribute to these different areas. We've seen FE budgets increased in the last budgets in Scotland, England and Wales, and we've not seen government direct funding of universities increase in anything like the same amount.
Yeah, sorry, yes, and that makes sense what you're saying, yes. I mean, I keep looking at the data on the returns to different forms of education and training, and not only the data go up and down all the time, and also the interpretations of those data go up and down. So it's very hard to make judgments that stand even any test of time. But I agree with you that things are certainly shifting. The sense that the sense that I get is that it becomes it's very, very precarious. And what's happened for HE is that HE has joined the precarity, but still turned to, at the moment, those higher levels, currently deemed academic qualifications, still turn to as the way to have half a chance of securing a stronger future. To give you my Birmingham example yet again, it's the up and downness of the vet provision that makes me nervous. So Birmingham is hanging on by a thread because we've got HS2. We run all the training for HS2. We've got a big training academy. Half the staff seem to live and work in Birmingham. And so my view is long may it last, may HS2 never be finished. That's keeping us going. But I have a feeling that there's quite a lot of kind of technical vocational areas that are similar. They're very precarious, they come and go. And bubbles are more short-lived. So that's happening as well, as you point out, with higher level and higher education qualifications and routes. But yeah, I see exactly what you're saying. I'm not sure that it will even itself out. It'll carry on being boom bust. That is what my sense is.
Thank you.
Eddie?
Gonzalo, can we take down the slides so that people can see the land?
Well, I can see the room here.
Yeah, but there's when people can't see it, they're asking for.
But I'm online and I can see it.
Just need to unshare. If anyone online can spotlight the room so they can see it.
Oh, I know.
So it's not blowing.
Eddie?
Hello, yes, thank you. There's someone with a hand up before me, I think, unless. Very happy to go if it's me. Yes, thank you very much, Anne-Marie. That was, I mean, I think it's a very fertile sort of framing of the issues. My initial reflection really is that it seems to me the benefits of, when we talk about tertiary, the benefits of a tertiary approach, the case for that is the benefit of a system approach, a whole system approach, and I suppose that implies that, in your terms, that we're going to take a broader, more inclusive, more unified approach to the field. So the field is enlarged and kind of unified rather than seeing lots of separate fields. I mean, you acknowledge that there's a lot of institutional there's a lot of hierarchies of value in the system at the moment, between institutions, between qualifications, and so on. And I guess I would see the benefit of a tertiary system as breaking down some of those hierarchies of value and moving away from a kind of marketized approach where people and qualifications and institutions are seen as commodities. I mean, it's interesting that Bourdieu chose to use the capital metaphor, and I'm not sure he meant to kind of. I mean, I don't know. I think he used the metaphor before human capital became such a global kind of framing for education and the economy. But it does imply that value that we think of people and qualifications and institutions and skills and so on as commodities which have a kind of exchange value and a use value, and some of them, some of these are really useful, actual qualifications that mean actual useful skills in the here and now. But so much of the thinking now is about qualifications, grades, and so on as what they allow you to access in terms of elite routes and access to better paying jobs and so on. And I mean, all of that speaks of a over marketized system. So I'm not quite sure what I'm saying, but I think if we see the benefit of tertiary thinking as breaking some of that down, I guess what I'm suggesting is that maybe the field needs to be broadened and unified so that we can start to break down some of these unnecessary institutional hierarchies, because it's very corrosive in terms of our economy, in terms of opportunities. It's divisive. It tends to greater inequalities and so on. It pushes us all into a kind of a way of thinking of what we're doing when we're learning and gaining credit for learning, gaining qualifications, as being a kind of race for scarce resources, scarce opportunities, and that doesn't really contribute to thriving economies, inclusive economies, more equal economies. So that's just a reflection on, and it's just that I suppose the capital metaphor troubles me a little bit, because it kind of, in a way, it kind of moves us towards that thinking. I'm sure it's not what Bourdieu intended, but it does do that, doesn't it? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for those reflections. I think so. Just to say two things. The first is what you've articulated, I think, is what James Robson articulated really well last week as well, complementing what you're saying, which is that he had ideas about how the limitations of the policy in the white paper, in terms of not moving towards what you're saying, which is how do people think together and think in productive ways, and not just have a set of regulation that doesn't necessarily take you to that next stage that you're describing. And I think he talked about that really well, and I haven't talked about that at all. You're absolutely right this week. And I think you're also absolutely right about the limitation in terms of Bourdieu's use of capital in terms of where we go next. And although I use Bourdieu quite a lot to understand and critique what goes on, I do sympathise with people, and to some extent what you're implying is there, which is it offers a critique of what we see, but it doesn't take us forward. And particularly those tools don't necessarily say how we might have a future that looks different and goes in another direction. And people are beginning to use very different ways of thinking to do that. And to an extent, what you're saying is implying exactly that we need to think differently and open up a way of thinking that has what Appidurai talks about. He talks about having a way of thinking in aspirational terms of how we can think and live differently and can create the conditions for that. I'm not sure that you can do that with Bourdieu's tools, including the way he uses capital. You have to build on and beyond his tools to do that. So my caveat right at the beginning very much is it helps to critique what's going on and what might be the cautions we have, but it doesn't necessarily then take us to how we can properly, as you've described, move forward in a productive and positive way. Thank you for that.
There was another question online that I didn't see before. Sireb?
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, so I was wondering, you know, it's a very different system from the US and community colleges, but I wonder if you all have taken any lessons from the American community college system when thinking about the partnerships between further education and higher education. I also think I specifically wonder too if, especially in the financial crisis that current higher education institutions in the UK are in, if partnering with the further education institutions is an opportunity to potentially lighten any of the burden on the higher education institutions by diverting or at least bringing some of the students there in the short term under a different funding structure.
I can only answer to the limited extent that I know, so just bear with the fact that I'm only giving you a slightly anecdotal answer and certainly not what's going on absolutely up to the minute. There were certainly attempts in terms of policy talk, particularly during the 2010s under the Conservative and then the coalition government, to say we shouldn't be encouraging people into HE anymore. We should be encouraging them to go into further education and vet, and they can do higher level vet qualifications, and that's the solution, and that's the way forward. I haven't heard that actually being said right now, but I have to admit that I haven't looked very specifically at whether that is appearing somewhere. It's not loud. If it is currently being said, I think there's more interest in how people work between. And in terms of that community college to higher education link, to an extent, that's exactly what our foundations degrees tried to do. They were a 2-year foundation degree that was supposed to be the first 2 years of a bachelor degree, and you were supposed to have a guaranteed place to go on to what was often a final year, so a 3rd year. So there was a notion that we were trying to set up a system that learned from that idea. It wasn't hugely successful, I think would be fair to say. Had lots of problems.
David, and then please.
Really interesting. Thank you so much. I mean, building on that kind of this US model, and obviously we wouldn't start from here. It'd be a shame if we're not starting from California, but where we are, and I'm just being a bit provocative here, but there is a real politique to the fact that the system doesn't exist. So that, I mean, you're using this word system, but it doesn't exist. That's fair. You have a system. The numbers are really interesting, I thought, because it looked like 20 times as many people were doing degrees as they were doing sub-degrees. So the integration is always going to be of a very large fish in a pond that is faced with trying to work with lots of minnows, and you know what happens there, don't you? And so I guess I mean I was interested in you were right to spot the University of Birmingham rhetoric. Could one read that rhetoric in a sort of, if you got the policy levers tweaked in such a way that actually you began to measure that research innovation ecosystem on sort of things which were around employability jobs that were at a sub-degree level, and so actually go with the strengths of what seems to be the current employability narrative, and go with the strength of these institutions. I mean, is that just me being cynical?
No, I don't think it is, and I think that's where what James was saying last week about how policy can make a difference in terms of shaping the thinking and shaping the talk, and I think that's where both local and regional and national policy can try and shift those things. And he, I thought, put forward a very good critique of how what's currently appearing doesn't do that. So the LSIPs, the local strategy proposals and plans, don't push that in a way that supports that happening. And as I said, I've Birmingham University and the Vice Chancellor there, I think, could do really good work, and so do the colleges. So I wouldn't suggest a criticism of either, but it's quite difficult to find bases on which to work. So you do have to have really good strategic leads, I think, to bring those organisations together. And I think that's part of the big challenge. What are your strategic structures for making that possible? And there's so many. If you look, if I take my Birmingham and Midlands example again, who on earth are you actually going to use? You've got so many different potential leaders of a network, and that's certainly that's what, when Ken Spoilers, who writes a lot about ecologies of practice and local ecologies of practice, that's what he writes about. What would that look like? Who would you get to establish that positively moving forward thinking where you can work together? I don't think the individuals and the individual institutions would have anything against that, but to really make it happen when you're actually struggling for resources and numbers and to survive, you actually need some extra push to create that culture and structure for it to happen.
So we've been researching this space for decades now, and I just want to draw on those decades. So governments have been wanting permeability between FE and HE, or vocational education and HE, for more than 30 years, probably 40, 50. And they've put in place a lot of measures, qualifications, frameworks, and there was a lot of emphasis in the early 2000s in Australia and here on partnerships between institutions and on dual sector institutions, and nothing much actually resulted from that. We still, to me, the problems that we've got today are the problems we had 25 years ago in many ways, particularly in supporting students moving from FE to HE, because HE holds all the power in this relationship. I mean, they can choose to take students when they're hungry, and they can choose to just get rid of that partnership when they don't need it, as we've seen happen several times. Is there anything that's new now that might help change this? With the learning entitlement, I mean, I'd be interested in how that's actually going to work. It seems to me that if it's money that's allocated to the student and money follows the student, then that's still going to result in the same sort of market and competition between institutions and between sectors for students, which is quite a different matter from institutions being funded, which is what I think should happen. Are there any policy measures, or what I haven't seen any policy measures that would actually reward collaboration, that institutions would be rewarded collaboration? So what do you think, drawing on your decades of research on this, what do you think are the prospects? I mean, my own views have changed a lot in the last 25 years, and now I'm sort of thinking we should be supporting FE to offer higher level qualifications and develop more applied research than rely on universities, because they can't be trusted fundamentally. But also that course of action also has problems. But what do you think?
Okay, so this is coming from a personal point of view, and from all those years of research. I have worked with, and I continue to work with Bourdieu, and I said right at the beginning, it does lead you more towards the depths of despair than anything else. And I don't feel hugely optimistic about where we go, but where I would be putting my energies and efforts is definitely into further education, because I think as a possibility of having what are now being called anchor institutions, they are the sort of institutions that the most part are still rooted in wanting to work within their regions and their localities. And I think universities struggle with that because they work nationally and internationally. So if you want local and regional, then you do have to really work with your colleges. I think a strength of the colleges, and perhaps I would say that because it's the area that I've researched a lot, and also have a lot of sympathy with many of the things that they've managed to achieve, even if they're challenging and not always succeeding as much as they might do. They work with a whole range of partners that are ignored by other organisations or that can't get together. So they do work with employers, small, medium and large. They do work with training providers. They do work with third sector organisations. They work with all sorts of people. And so that's, I think, really significant, that engagement. So they're an organisation and a grouping of organisations that could be location of things shifting. But you do, I think, need something. I think locally and regionally, and for me, locally and regionally, I agree with all that thinking that's going on around locally and regionally being really important, whatever that is called or whatever it looks like in different places and contexts, because those things are what have half a chance of shifting and making people think differently. But you need something at that regional stroke local level that makes it happen, that's above whichever organisations you choose to think can lead the way. You need something that helps them to be able to do it, because FE colleges, for example, are as strapped and struggling as much as anyone else, even if it's in different ways. So do I feel optimistic? I must admit, after I looked at what James Robson said last week, I thought, well, in 2 years' time, when we have the next general election, then what? And that was my big fear, really, is even if we manage to do something for the next year or so, what happens next? And so that makes me very concerned and worried in terms of how can you shift thinking enough that it can keep going in the face of the sort of struggles that it will have to face. I'm handing on to all you people sitting in this room who are going to be alive a lot longer than me, who are going to have to address those problems. I do think they're moments when they seem insurmountable. That's not helpful, is it? But that's where I stand.
Well, I think we are. Yeah. Probably we can take one last question because of the time, and there is one online. Dan?
Hi, thanks so much, Anne-Marie, for what a really, really great session. I'm not sure if I have any hope myself around this, but I wanted to ask you a bit more directly about whether the features of the lifelong learning entitlement, whether you think that they may have the capacity of shifting the dial over the longer term towards the kind of local, regional, connected mission that you've indicated. I'm guessing people would know roughly what the LLE proposes, but I wonder if you could reflect on that.
It's only a personal reflection. Obviously, I haven't got any really specific or researched evidence, but there certainly is evidence that those sorts of things, like the lifelong learning entitlement, can make a difference. So the removal of the adult education budget has been well researched, and the effect, and the very strong and negative effect, was very well researched in terms of what it did. And there's also been quite a large amount of work on the effects of student fees on who participates in what and who goes where. So if those sorts of things can be analogies for what the lifelong learning entitlement might do, then following that, you would expect that it has a chance of making some sort of difference. I wouldn't like to say what the difference will be, but it's shifting how you arrange the funding does affect things, and so therefore it should potentially make a difference. The research suggests that there is some trend towards people studying and training locally more than they did. So I would anticipate, but this is again only based on the limited evidence that I've looked at, that would be potentially a continuing trend at the moment, certainly for the majority of people, if you cut off the elite at the very top that probably aren't affected by any of that. So yeah, but the short answer is potentially yes, but I have no evidence.
So sorry for asking you to speculate, but given all of your experience, it's just fascinating to hear your view on that. I guess I'm wondering if you think there is a cause for hope in terms of FE providers being able to utilise the LLE to achieve some of the outcomes that are desirable.
One of the fantastic things about FE is that they're great at seizing a chance. I'd be saying, yeah, there's hope there, definitely.
Well, pushing.
Thank you so much.
John Holford.
Hello. All of this has been fascinating for me. I should explain that I've been researching higher education pretty much all my life and been part of several universities. I had a part-time role at Education Department in Oxford for a while, but in fact most of it was at the Open University. I ran a higher education research centre, from there. So I just wanted to suggest quite a wicked suggestion in a sense, which I think is relevant to this evening's discussions, of how about trying to get a project going which would make a comparison of the two OUs, Open or Oxford, because it seems to me that there are a lot of very different, issues, kind of coming there. And also, one of the other things I would just add, which I'm not sure that we've particularly focused, on that today, is the arrival of artificial intelligence. And the accessibility of education, and life moving into technology and away from people. So there's an awful lot that is happening, and I often say, with all of these things, that it presents a mixture of challenges and opportunities. So there's plenty of, important questions to continue to try and answer. And this evening has been a massively useful development of that.
Thanks, John. Yeah, we know each other because you had some involvement with the Further Higher project all those years ago. So
that's right.
So thank you for those comments. I think that's a wonderful idea. If I leave that in the hands of everyone in this room for your Oxford OU project, it would be absolutely fascinating. But I agree. I've hidden from the AI and the climate crisis questions because I would have dug a hole and jumped into the hole. But yeah, it's massive, and there's some really good thinking going on, which is trying to engage with what we've been talking about this evening and bringing those issues to bear on it. And you're absolutely right to identify that gap that needs to be brought into the equation of what we're talking about. So thank you for that.
And finally, John Holford.
Okay, thank you. I think what I wanted to say was largely reflected in my note in the chat, but it really I suppose it goes down to Anne-Marie. You focused on the big players, and you mentioned the small players, Furcroft and so forth and so on, but you didn't spend much time on that, and I suspect that's because the drives of research funding and of policy are driven by money. And that's where the institutional and policy pressures go. But I mean, having spent God knows how long in HE institutions and in adult education bodies and on FE governors and goodness knows what. I mean, what seems to drive the practical decisions of the leaders of these institutions is the search for cash. Very little time, in my experience, is spent in the governing bodies of these institutions on questions of what educational activities should be going on. They're you know, if essentially if a field of work or if an area will pay, that's the area to go into. And I just wondered whether we need to think about, you know, and this, and so the whole fabric of your talk assumed a market-driven system. And I just wondered whether the time has come, not that I have any hope that it will, whether the time has come to move away from a market-driven system and come to one which looks much more at providing incentives to institutions which are not purely financial. Or am I just utopian?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And James Robson, I think, I've only looked at his slides because I couldn't hear his presentation last week, but I think that was one of his really strong arguments that he was trying to articulate, that we have to move, doing exactly what you said, we have to move away from a market-driven system and have and support at policy level, but also enable all those engaged to operate differently and to think differently in terms of their relationships and what they're trying to do. And I think certainly what I saw of what he was saying, he articulated really strongly that shift should be possible, but only by rethinking and then re-articulating what we're trying to aim for. So really saying exactly what you are, which is that a market-driven system that's only chasing money to survive is not going to enable these things to happen. So thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Anne-Marie, for your wonderful presentation, and thank you everyone for your questions, your comments. So next week we continue with our series. Here is the calendar. Next week we have Gavin Moody, who is one of the organizers of this series, and the title is How Tertiary is English Post-Secondary Education. So we're going to be waiting for you here in this room at this time next Thursday. Thank you very much.